Alrighty, thank you to everyone who joined. So great to see so many familiar faces and a couple new ones, and we hope that everyone here can learn a lot. Just to note that this is the first of 3 webinars that we'll be doing around discrimination. This one is an intro, so some of the topics we'll be going into more depth about as we get later into the series. But yeah. I hope that everyone here can at least learn something from everything that we are talking about today. And Naomi, I think I'm going to hand it off to you.
Yeah, thank you everyone for coming. I think we are maybe going to do some introductions for the USL members. So I'm Naomi Atwood, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. And my affiliations are with USL and ASB at South Whidbey High School, as well as a few other clubs. And I'll pass it off to Maggie.
Great, thank you so much. My name is Maggie Natras. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm affiliated with USL, Social Justice Club, formerly with Whidbey Climate Strike and Queer and Trans Club. And I will pass it off to Jackson.
Hi, I'm Jackson Murphy, a member of USL, a member of Dismantling Systemic Racism Committee for the City of Langley, president of Queer and Trans Club, and member of Ecology Club. I'll pass it off to Maddie.
Hi, I'm Maddie Racico, and my pronouns are she, her, and my affiliations are with USL, South Whidbey Social Justice Club, and Ecology Club. And I will pass it to Tori.
Hi everyone, my name is Tori Green. My pronouns are she, her. My affiliations are with USL and Social Justice Club at South Whidbey High School.
And I'm going to pass it off to Audrey. I believe you just joined.
Hi, I'm Audrey. The pronouns I use are she, her. I'm affiliated with USL. I'm also a student representative on the South Whidbey School Board, and I'm also a part of ASB.
Great, thank you. For all of the people in the audience, if you could please put your name, pronouns, and any affiliations you'd like known in the chat, that would be great. And then we can start jumping in to a little bit of Zoom technicalities. Naomi, you can go ahead if you'd like.
Yeah, okay. So first we're just going to go over a little bit of like webinar protocol to make this like a pretty smooth webinar. So we would like to ask everyone to turn on their cameras if possible for safety reasons, as well as keeping your mic muted to eliminate as much background noise as possible, because that can be very distracting while we're presenting. And then also, like many of you already done, just putting your name and pronouns, and if you want affiliations in your Zoom name. And so if you need help with renaming yourself, there's 2 ways that you can kind of look at the graphics here on the slide. You can either first click the participants button and then find your name, the more button, and then rename, or you can go to your picture and find the 3 dots in the top corner and hit rename from there as well. And then the protocol, if there's a disturbance, is just to turn your camera off. And we'll try to get the disturbance out as quick as possible. And if there's anything especially triggering for you, you can feel free to leave, and we can contact you via email after the meeting. Is there anything I missed from other USL members?
Yeah, if you do want to leave and need a response from us as far as being triggered within this meeting, feel free to just directly contact one of the USL members here. You can put it in the chat privately. But other than that, I think you covered it really well, Naomi. Jackson, anything to add? Maddie and Tori, thumbs up real quick. Great, go ahead.
Okay, so who we are as USL. So USL is a student-led and organized group, and we focus on a range of social justice topics, as well as fighting the climate crisis. So USL was founded over 2 years ago by 2 students at South Whidbey High School. And they started by protesting 2 local banks, Chase and Wells Fargo, who are some of the biggest investors in fossil fuels. And then they launched the Transforming Education campaign pretty recently that successfully got an ethnic studies and environmental science class at the South Whidbey High School. And in the spring, we have organized a counter protest to an anti-education protest who wanted to remove the BLM banner, as well as remove the critical race theory from being taught in our schools, and take away comprehensive sex ed that is inclusive to the LGBTQIA+ community. And we had a really successful turnout of almost 400 students and community members that came together. So that was really great. We also got a climate emergency declaration passed by the city of Langley. And currently the city has a climate crisis action committee working towards looking at the city's carbon emissions and how we can help slow the climate crisis. And currently we are working on a proposal to Island County to declare a climate emergency so that we can get it to the county level. And we kicked off this campaign in the end of September with a school walkout climate strike with a turnout of almost 200 people, 100 of those being students, to show that, you know, we're really passionate about this. So that's kind of what we've been up to recently. Again, does any USL member want to add anything to that?
No, I think you covered that really well. Jackson, do you want to jump in?
I was just going to say the same thing. Thank you.
Awesome.
Okay, great. So right now we're in the middle of like a 3-part webinar series of 3 webinars each. So sorry, that was a little complicated. But this is the Intro to Discrimination webinar for the Discrimination webinar series. And on December 14th, we'll hold the second on racial discrimination and ethnic discrimination. And then the third will be held on January 4th, which is the final one on LGBTQIA+ discrimination. And then in August, we finished up the Patriarchy webinar series, which was kind of the beginning. And then later on in the year, we are going to have a climate crisis webinar series as well. So we wanted to go over kind of why we are doing this series and why it's important to us. So we are doing this webinar series to spread awareness about what discrimination is and how it affects our society and culture every day. We are hoping that these webinars will help our community be aware of discrimination and ways to dismantle systemic discrimination, because it's a big part of our society and world right now. And we hope that everyone here can leave with a new perspective on our world and find ways to help better our community every day. Next slide, please.
Okay, and before we jump straight into a trigger warning, we just wanted to say thank you to the Whidbey Community Foundation for a grant that we were given to put on these webinars, specifically this webinar and the 2 others that will follow it. And we're really looking forward to being able to use those funds, especially when we have a couple guest speakers that will be joining us in the next webinars. So yeah, just a great thank you to them. Anything else to add before we jump right in? Awesome.
Okay, so we just want to do a trigger warning before we start, because we know the things that we're going to be talking about today might be very triggering for some who have been negatively affected by the systems we are going to talk about. And so if you do feel triggered, you can always turn your camera off or leave the meeting if you wish to do so. And then you can always contact us afterwards as well. And we do know that these topics like that we're going to talk about come with discomfort, because that's the way these systems have been like developed in our society. And so if you can, we want to challenge you to welcome that discomfort, because it's going to help us learn more and figure out ways that we can help dismantle the systems. So now I'm going to pass it off to Maggie.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Naomi. So we're just going to jump straight into a quick reflection. The question will be, what comes to mind when people say discrimination? And we're going to take about 2 minutes to do this. If you can please put your answer in the chat, that would be amazing. We want to be able to get community input and thought process on this one before jumping straight into the rest of the topics that we'll be covering. If we also don't get too many submissions, then we might have a couple students share out a bit about what they think, and then we'll jump straight into the rest of the webinar. Some of the ones that are coming into the chat right now are being judgmental, unequal pay, unfair treatment due to isms, racism, sexism, ableism, etc. Let's see here, prejudice, putting people into groups and then making a hierarchy of those groups and then treating people according to this. Thank you to everyone who's putting things in the chat. I don't know if I should continue reading off, so I will leave that up to the rest of the students here.
If everyone could just read them themselves, that'd be good. Students see one that they really want to share. We can. One person said the use of power by a dominant culture to advantage itself.
Thank you to everyone who is putting responses in the chat. I also saw unfairness and lack of basic kindness. Alrighty, Jackson, do you want to jump on in? I can move to the next slide if you think we're ready.
I think just a couple more minutes. We're still having people go into the chat. So like maybe 1 more minute to make sure we get everyone's input and just have people read through all the ones that are coming in and then we can move on.
Sounds like a plan, thanks.
Okay, thank you again, everyone who shared, and just make sure to keep reading through the chat as they come in as we keep going through this. Okay, we also wanted to do a privilege check before we got into all of this. We live in a pretty white community and a pretty straight cis community, a pretty privileged community overall. And that is reflected here in this meeting. So as you go into this, make sure you're checking your privileges and your biases around all of these topics, big or small. And just make sure that you are open to listening. This webinar, we're going over the basics of a lot of these things. So you have greater understanding going into the next 2. So you might not find yourselves as challenged in this one as you will be farther on, but just make sure you're continuing to check your privileges and being open to listening and think before you say something in our Q&A at the end or in reflections like the one you just did. And I'll pass it off to Maggie to go into our basic definition.
Thank you, Jackson. So yeah, just to start off, discrimination as the definition that we can find on the internet is the unfair or prejudicial treatment of people and groups based on characteristics such as race, gender, age, or sexual orientation. And you will hear those 4 repeated a lot in this webinar, but there are many others that we will not be covering or we will be talking about very briefly. So basically, to break that down completely, discrimination comes from a fear of difference, and this ties into tribalism, the fear of a group that is not one of your own, or also not taking someone who is not part of your group in with kindness or treating them the same way as you would a family member or another person who you would consider close to yourself. So this could mean if you are white, that you don't treat people who are BIPOC as well as you would treat another person who's white. This could be if you're straight, you could have a prejudice towards people who are LGBTQIA+. There are many different forms and they vary. It could also mean that you don't treat someone the same way that you treat your family member. But this is just something that we want to bring up as we dive into a little bit more of what discrimination is and some of the major ways that we find discrimination within our society as a whole. Jackson?
Thank you, Maggie. And just a warning, my dogs are walking around and making little clickety clacks all over the floor. So if you hear that, that's what it is. Okay, macro and microaggressions. Just some more good vocab that you should know going into these webinars and just really in life. Macroaggressions are large scale or overt aggression towards those of a certain race, culture, gender, age, or sexual orientation. This is what you probably think of when you think of discrimination. And it's not as prevalent on Whidbey as microaggressions, though it still does exist. Macroaggressions are hate, or just more than just misunderstanding. So that is what microaggressions are. Microaggressions are the everyday slight dignities, insults, put downs, and invalidations that people of a certain race, culture, gender, age, or sexual orientation experience in their day-to-day interactions with well-intentioned individuals who are unaware that they're engaging in an offense or demeaning form of behavior. This is the underlying parts of discrimination that I think a lot of people who aren't the targets of this discrimination even recognize. And I think it is something that happens a lot on Whidbey, and a lot of people don't even realize it's kind of happening, and something that I think most people could learn to recognize more in their lives. This could be a pretty well-known one, is like touching Black people's hair, or like questioning, like accusing like some like Black people from stealing from a store, for example, or just like perpetuating stereotypes, or just like one that I have found is I'm a swimmer, and the stereotype about Black people is they don't know how to swim, and so people have been surprised that I'm a swimmer. And it's kind of like, you could say they didn't mean it that way, but they kind of don't have to. And so I think that's kind of like a lot of like what racism kind of is that people don't understand. So yeah, I got there at the end. Next slide. Okay, this is racism. Racism is broad, and it covers so many racial groups, ethnicities, cultures, etc., that I think it's very, very hard to define. I think we found a pretty good definition, but it also isn't perfect. So racism is a belief that inherent differences among the various human racial groups determine cultural or individual achievement, usually involving the idea that one's own race is superior and has a right to dominate others, or that a particular racial group is inferior to others. And why underlined usually is because it doesn't always have to thinking that your race is superior and has a right to dominate. It can also be that you just have the belief that there are inherent differences among various human racial groups that determine cultural or individual achievement, which is what I see, which I think we see more, at least in our community, than the full-on superiority of white supremacy. So yeah. And some microaggressions that come with racism are stereotypes and different treatments, kind of just what I talked about before, and expanding that, obviously. I'm just trying to speak from my own kind of experience in school. Macroaggressions, slurs and derogatory comments. It's also very broad, but like, I think you know what I mean, harming or killing on the basis of race. So I think macroaggressions, as I said, we see less on Whidbey, but slurs, I would say we see quite a bit on Whidbey, or at least in my experience. So yes, next slide, please. Okay. Racism recently. Obviously, there's the Black Lives Matter movement in response to police brutality. And I think that there's just so much to go into around police brutality, but I think that it also woke a lot of white people up to the problems that BIPOC people face, not just Black people. And I think if they've been a lot more open to the work since then. And I think that's why USL has had so much success in our transforming education campaign, when others have had less success previously to this movement. And protect Asian lives in results to anti-Asian violence in response to COVID-19, and the border wall, which is Trump's idea, but is in response to really anti-immigration from Republicans. And I think racism is totally entwined in this, because we don't really have a problem, or we don't talk about when we talk about immigration from like Canada or other places, we talk about the southern border almost exclusively. And I think that if it were white people coming from the southern border, we wouldn't be as concerned about this, if at all, because of the stereotypes and the underlying and overt racism in our country. And so, yeah. And Islamophobia, kind of what I'm referring to with that is discrimination against people, Muslim people, especially in the wake of 9/11 and terrorism. And this is, again, to tribalism. We are America, they are Islam, even though it's a small sect of Islam and not the full group. And I think tribalism and racism has made us homogenize all of Islam, or a lot of people have, and just making sure that we're not being tribalistic and racist. So yeah, and I'll pass it off to you, Maggie.
Awesome, thank you, Jackson. So next form of discrimination that we'll be going over is homophobia. Another quick definition is the fear, hatred, discomfort with, or mistrust of people who are queer. Quick definition or background into queer as a word. It has been used on both sides as something that's been reclaimed by the LGBTQIA+ community, and as something that has been used to target the same community. More recently, it's been used in a way to kind of encompass that entire group of individuals, especially because the acronym does not always actually represent everyone who is within that community. So that's why I'm using that here. Some forms of macroaggressions, very similar to what Jackson went over, but violence and aggression, slurs and derogatory comments. Again, these things are found in some day-to-day life, but probably not as often as some of the microaggressions that I'll be going into next. Those slurs, again, are fairly common in most schools, for example, especially here in Whidbey. And then we also have stereotypes as far as microaggressions. We have unequal treatment and opportunities, and we also have heteronormativity. So some of the examples that I can give are when someone approaches a same-sex couple and asks, which one of you is the man or the woman in the relationship? That kind of thinking is inherently different and not quite understanding the point, and is not something that I think most people think of as inherently a microaggression, but it is disheartening and something that needs to be pointed out. Another example is someone only seeing a person who is part of the LGBTQIA+ community as their identity and not seeing them as a whole person outside of that. And that sort of a thing, again, is all in the mindset and leads to the systemic issues that we have today around homophobia, and is something that is inherently a part of heteronormativity, the belief that being heterosexual is the default and is the only thing that is normal, for example. Some examples today in society of homophobia: conversion therapy. For those of you who need a quick refresher on what conversion therapy is, it is basically usually religion-based, sending someone who is part of the LGBTQIA+ community who is queer to a conversion camp in order to change inherently who they are. It can lead to depression, anxiety, drug use, homelessness, and suicide. It is run under the false assumption that you can change your identity, and that if you're educated or if you commit to XYZ, you will not be part of a community or believe certain things. And then we also have marriage equality. And while, of course, in the United States, this is now a right that people have, it took us until June 26th, 2015 to officially have this passed in court. And I think that's something that we all just need to recognize, especially for me as someone who was born in 2003. It is incredibly shocking to know that my generation and people that I know and love would not be able to get married until 2015. And then all of this ties into intersectionality. So as Jackson described earlier, racism is a prevalent problem in our society, and there are people who are queer and who are BIPOC, and there are people who are queer and who are lower middle class, so on and so forth, other things that we will be talking about today. And it's important to recognize that there are a lot of interconnections with those various things that set you apart from what's considered the default. And we'll be talking about this all throughout our webinars. Maddie will also be discussing a few more examples of intersectionality, but I think it's just something that's important to recognize, especially because not all people who are queer have the same level of privilege. So something to think about. And Jackson, I think I'm passing this back to you.
Yeah, and I saw a question in the chat that I would like to address. It was, what does the term LGBTQIA plus mean? It is a descriptor for the queer and trans community, so everyone part of that: lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, intersex, asexual, and the plus is just beyond, as we're running out of space with the letters. So you can call the community that, or the queer and trans community, but it encompasses everything that's not heterosexual and cis, which is mean the gender that you were assigned at birth, you are now, or you, yeah. And, okay, now we're going to go into transphobia. This is rejection of the trans identity and a refusal to acknowledge that it can possibly be real or valid. The consequences of transphobia are that trans people struggle to live openly and comfortably in society, and ultimately, and the ultimate outcome is maybe the erasure of trans people as a viable class of people. And some microaggressions. Microaggressions are not respecting the validity of various trans identities, and dead naming is another one, which is if a trans person changes their name to better fit them and not using that. And intrusive questions about intimate details. It's not your business. You don't need to know, and they will tell you if they want you to know. And several of the microaggressions listed here, used with knowledge, are macroaggressions. They kind of toe the line. And as I kind of said, macro and micro are the edges of the scale that we kind of use to measure discrimination, I guess. And just a quick note about transphobia before I go into macroaggressions. I believe transphobia is one of the most accepted forms of discrimination still in our society. And I think we really have a long way to go still with trans rights, more than I think a lot of other movements currently. Macroaggressions, attempting to move trans people's rights or fighting against ones that they have not gotten yet, or purposeful misgendering, which is using the wrong pronouns for someone. And yeah, it's pretty easy, so just don't do it. And I'll pass it off to Maggie.
Thank you, Jackson. And yeah, people are at various stages in their knowledge about the trans community. So some things are obviously not meant to be macroaggressions, as far as misgendering, for example, as Jackson said earlier. So there is a certain leeway there, but it's important to recognize the intention behind your words, especially around making certain that you use the right pronouns, for example. So going into gender identity, and this is something that we'll be going into a lot more in later webinars because it is quite a big topic, but gender identity, just for those of you here today, is one's innermost concept of oneself. So as male or female, a blend of both or neither, it's how individuals perceive themselves and what they call themselves. So one's gender identity can be the same or different from their sex assigned at birth. If you are cisgender, it means that you identify with the same gender that is, say, what the doctor assigned you at birth, basically. And it is just a label. It is not meant to be derogatory for anyone who might have had that thought process. Non-binary, using they, them pronouns, and also not identifying as male or female, but anywhere else on that line. That flag is up here. It is the yellow, white, purple, and black flag. We have women. This is a form of gender identity. Gender fluid up in the other corner, the pink, white, purple, black, and blue. And then we also have man, another form of gender identity, and cisgender. So again, whatever you were assigned at birth. And there are many others that we are not covering today because it all depends on what you personally identify with, and we couldn't possibly cover them all in the next hour and a half. Transphobia, examples within society itself around gender identity or just in general, are things such as the panic defense. So for those of you who don't know what that is, if someone is transgender and someone else does not know that they were transgender but find out either after they have been in a relationship or just in general, in some states, it is within your rights to then attack and possibly kill that transgender person. And this is still a law in several states in the United States and throughout the world. And then we also have gender-specific bathrooms. There was a huge debate about this a while ago, and there continues to be a debate about this. This is all inherently tied to transphobia. And if you start learning and understanding the trans community a little bit more, you can understand that this isn't a super difficult ask in some semblances of that word. So basically understanding what trans people are talking about as far as gender specific or gender neutral bathrooms is that when a bathroom is gender neutral, it is not labeled as man or woman at the top, and it makes more some trans people, especially those who are non-binary, who don't really identify with either of those labels, more comfortable just in their everyday life. And this is something we will also be going into more in our next webinar, or 2 webinars from now. But Tori, I'm going to pass it to you. Actually,
I would just like to say that conversion therapy also affects the trans community and it's not exclusive to the queer community. But yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you, Maggie. Okay, now moving on to classism. To break it down, the definition of classism is described as prejudice against or in favor of people belonging to a particular social class. So some examples of this could be seeing a certain group of people as less than you based on the class that they are in, choosing to disassociate with those people who are not in the same class as you, or having mass assumptions on a particular class that generalizes every human involved. So some examples of this that are current could be healthcare, insurance, housing, wage gap, etc. So for example, with healthcare, people who don't have money will not be able to afford to save their own life in a very basic way. So something about housing, this is directly affecting Whidbey Island right now. The people who are able to do the basic jobs such as waitressing, working in retail shops, and working in grocery stores are not able to afford the housing in Langley as it is. That leaves people in need of workers and people in need of renters. So with wage gap, the people who are privileged enough may not be affected or even know about the wage gap. Depending on who you are and what you do, you get paid less than other individuals. You could be doing the same thing as another person, but could be actively getting paid differently. So for example, with classism and discrimination, this could be with how someone appears. Someone could appear to be from a lower class and then be treated differently, accused differently, followed by someone because of their appearance, and judged in store. If someone is about to ask a question, that person may assume that they are wanting money, although they are actually just asking about the time or directions. And intellectual elitism, a highly educated person may not make the time for people who are below them. Upper class people may not want to befriend someone who is in a class below them. They see them in a worse light. This could be gas station workers, ferry workers, electricians, plumbers, truckers, etc. Next slide.
Jackson.
Okay. Thank you, Tori. This is how power imbalance creates discrimination. Oppressors cannot be oppressed by those they are oppressing, which is kind of a confusing sentence, but it's good. That means that in the context of America, BIPOC people cannot be racist towards white people as they're being systematically oppressed. Just as a gay person cannot be heterophobic. Trans people cannot be cisphobic. And this is because white straight cis men hold the paramount role of privilege and the power and are contributing to the oppression of people that are not them. Other groups could be women, cannot be sexist towards men. And the groups above mentioned, however, being systemically oppressed by those and do not hold a position of power. Kind of said that out of order. I think this is kind of, for those who hold the privilege, it's kind of hard for them to understand. But I hope that was good. And we're doing questions next. So if you have any questions on that or anything, so we can go to the next slide, sorry.
Yeah, the other thing I wanted to add in before we switched, was that if you inherently are in a position of power, there's also a power imbalance there. So those who are in elected office, for example, have a modicum of power over those who don't. And that's just something else to recognize, especially because we do have a few people who are in those positions here today. And I'm so glad to see you here. But yeah, we'll be diving into questions. I'm going to stop screen sharing temporarily. But yeah, I want to hear from anyone who does need some clarification around some of the things that we've gone over. And then depending on how many questions we do have, we'll have either a 5 or 2 minute break just to give everyone a chance to breathe before going into the next section of this webinar. But yeah, any questions? We're going to start jumping into the next section now. So thank you all for coming back. And Maddie, I believe I'm passing it over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Maggie. So for the final segment of this webinar, I'm going to just be discussing intersectionality, which is the understanding that systems of power and oppression do not operate independently and separately from one another. So because of this, oh, sorry, I just saw you turn up your volume. Am I a little quiet? I can talk a little bit. Sorry, guys. So because of this, there are many people whose social identities overlap to create compounding experiences of discrimination. And it's crucial that we center the voices of those people in the fight for social justice, because they have sort of a different understanding of these systems of oppression that they're like simultaneously experiencing. So in order to truly understand discrimination and take steps towards eliminating it, we must acknowledge intersectionality. In the next few slides, I'm just going to discuss a little bit about various forms of discrimination as they relate to other systems of oppression and world issues. Next slide. All right. So first up is discrimination and the patriarchy. And I did go into this a lot more in the previous webinar series, the patriarchy. So if you want to go on the USL YouTube, that's recorded for those of you who weren't here for our first webinar series. But I'll just start right off with misogynoir, which is a specific type of misogyny experienced by Black women that is rooted in racism and anti-Blackness. It's a form of discrimination that's often overlooked, and the first step towards dismantling it is just awareness. So in a patriarchal society, women are constantly battling stereotypes. Black women, however, face different stereotyping and societal pressures than white women do. They're often falsely perceived as like loud, angry, or threatening, and are overtly sexualized. Another factor or part of misogynoir is the wage gap, which is much greater for Black women than it is for both white women and Black men. This is a perfect example of how overlapping social identities can create compounding experiences of discrimination. So Black men make, on average, 87 cents per dollar made by white men, which is an issue in itself. White women make about 79 cents per dollar made by white men, and Black women make only 63 cents. Which is significantly lower than both of those. And I also just wanted to mention that Latina women make about 55 cents, Native American women make 60 cents, and Asian American and Pacific Islander women make only 85 cents. So I also have sources for that if anyone would like those. So Black women also face discrimination in the healthcare industry as well as workplace discrimination. One example of this is like the stigma around protective hairstyles, which is viewed as unprofessional. And also just like they're often like less likely to get hired simply based on race. So this systemic oppression dating back to colonization and slavery can be identified as the root cause for most of these issues. So next, I'm going to go into a little bit of LGBTQIA plus discrimination in the patriarchy. So gender roles are built into the framework of the patriarchy, and living in a patriarchal society, we've been conditioned to associate masculine traits with men and feminine traits with women. Transphobia is rooted in the patriarchal belief that you must uphold the gender roles that you were assigned at birth. And heteronormativity, which I think Maggie discussed a little bit earlier, or maybe that was Jackson. Heteronormativity is the patriarchal concept, and it also perpetuates homophobia and transphobia. It's the assumption that gender is binary and heterosexuality is the standard or normal. And because the patriarchy operates under the assumption that gender is binary, people who use pronouns other than she, her, or he, him, and do not conform to male or female gender roles often face discrimination. So this is referring to non-binary people. Yeah, I think that's all I have for this slide. Okay, so discrimination and climate. I think one of the big points to talk about when discussing this connection is colonialism. Climate change is caused by the exploitation and degradation of our planet and its people, which is basically the definition of colonialism. With the expansion of European colonization came the extraction of natural resources from lands that were stolen from indigenous people. Indigenous cultures share a deep respect for the earth that we completely that was completely disregarded by colonizers. Their land management practices were destroyed with the commercialization of agriculture, and ever since then, we've just been in this cycle of taking and taking and taking. Indigenous people are now leading the fight against climate change, but even today, their voices are still going unheard by big corporations, building pipelines, and otherwise degrading Indigenous land. There's also a significant connection between slavery and the climate crisis that's often overlooked. I came across a quote the other day from Elizabeth Yempierre, I believe that's how you pronounce her last name, that I think does a much better job of making that connection that I would be able to articulate. So I'm just going to read that out. She said, with the arrival of slavery came repurposing of the land, chopping down trees, and disrupting water systems and other ecological relationships, all to support the effort of building a capitalist society and provide resources for the privileged, using the bodies of Black people to facilitate that. The fight against racial injustice and climate change are deeply intertwined, as you can see, and it's impossible to make progress on one issue without also addressing the other. Okay, so class issues are also responsible for the extension of the climate crisis. According to a report from Oxfam and the Stockholm Environmental Institute, the world's wealthiest 10% are responsible for over 50% of global emissions, and the 1% are responsible for 15% of global emissions. The wealthy tend to live very high carbon lifestyles that include flying often, owning multiple homes, and just general overconsumption. But personal consumption is actually not really the biggest factor in their contribution to the climate crisis. It's the more significant contribution is investments in the fossil fuel industry and financing corporations with unsustainable environmental practices. Poor communities, on the other hand, which contribute least to global emissions, tend to be disproportionately impacted by the consequences of the climate crisis. Those communities often lack resources such as reliable housing and infrastructure, and which makes them really susceptible to ecological disasters. So they're like the smallest part of the problem, but taking the brunt of the consequences. They're also less able to recover from the economic devastation that comes along with ecological disasters such as hurricanes and other extreme weather events. So eliminating class inequality is crucial in the fight for climate justice, and we need to continue to fight for both of those. And that is all I have for that slide. Okay, so lastly, I'm going to discuss the connection between racism and classism. So it's important to recognize that systemic racism is the root cause of wealth disparities between white people and people of color. Anti-Black policies dating back to slavery continue to reduce Black Americans' upward economic mobility. Employment discrimination, the prison pipeline, and many other factors contribute to Black households having less wealth, fewer assets, and greater debt. Low household income can prevent young Black people from receiving a college education, which just perpetuates the issue. As with other intersectional issues, it's impossible to eliminate class issues without addressing systemic racism. Many immigrants, so discrimination against immigrants is also a really big factor in this. And many immigrants, especially Latinx people, also face racial discrimination from white working class people that is rooted in ignorance and the fear of job competition. So white nationalism, which is the belief in maintaining a white racial and national identity, is most prominent amongst less educated working class white people. Despite the incredible contributions that immigrants make to our nation's economy, they're still perceived as burdens on our nation's finances and welfare. This harmful and untrue stereotyping often leads to the passage of restrictive immigration policies. Many immigrants also face discrimination and prejudice due to their economic status. They're often paid low, unsustainable wages based on their immigration status and looked down upon by wealthier white Americans. Many of these immigrants are refugees who fled dangerous situations in their home countries or came seeking economic opportunity. However, due to systemic racism, they too have restricted upward economic mobility. And I just want to say that this obviously does not cover everything. Intersectionality is an incredibly complex system of these overlapping identities, and we have such a short amount of time, but I do hope that this helped you all have a little better understanding of connections between these systems of power and oppression. And with that, I will pass it off to Maggie, I believe is next.
Thank you so much, Maddie. So we are going to start going into our closing. So after this, there'll be another Q&A session. We're trying to kind of create connections here and answer questions while educating and not kind of leaving people wondering. So don't feel afraid rather to speak up once we get to the questions. And we would love to be able to have a conversation with all of you about some of the things that we covered today. But before that, there are a few calls to actions that we have for everyone here. So first of all, promote this webinar series to friends and family. This will not be the last webinar that we do like this. The next one will be going into racial and ethnic discrimination more in depth. And we'll also be having a guest speaker. Diana Sandoval will be the person who is speaking for us, which is amazing. And we're very appreciative of the fact that she's jumping on with very little time to put things together, unfortunately. Share what you learned with the people around you. This could be common knowledge to some of you. It could be something that you haven't heard before. But this is meant to better our community and better those all around us. So please share out and let those around you know of some of the things that you've learned today. And also hold each other accountable. We are all learning, we are all growing, and I think it's incredibly important to make certain that if you did see something, a microaggression, for example, that you didn't know about before or that you did know about, that you speak up and speak on behalf of the person who's receiving that, and that you can hold the people around you accountable in other ways, such as calling them out if they say something that isn't exactly something that you think will actually be beneficial to the person that they're talking to, for example. There are many ways of being held accountable, but hopefully you all can just take that into account as we continue on from this webinar. But yeah, I'm opening it up to any other students. Any last words before we jump into Q&A?
I'd just like to stress, share what you've learned with the people around you. Especially with the people who wouldn't come to this on their own, because it isn't the people affected jobs to spread awareness about these issues. And even though we do, it shouldn't be just us. So if as much as you can share, please do. And thank you everyone for being here.
Any other students who want to give input?
I just wanted to say that I really appreciate everyone for being here. It's not an easy topic to learn and to reflect on and to seek information about, but I think it's super important in order to educate others and yourself on things that are so systemic that you might not even really realize. So I just am grateful for you all being here.
Absolutely. Maddie?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, like, because these issues are so systemic, like, we are all going to make mistakes every once in a while because it's just been so ingrained in society and everyone's minds. But by being here, you're showing that you want to learn and change. And I hope that you will all like go on to impact other people and help. I mean, this is the only way to make change. So yeah, again, thank you all for coming.
Awesome. Any USL students? Naomi, if you'd like to add anything else, you can, but Simone and Audrey, who are hopefully still here, you're free to add something as well if you'd like.
I just wanted to thank you guys for doing this presentation. You guys did a wonderful job, and you guys put in a lot of really important information. So thank you.
Thanks, Simone, and we will hopefully see you in the next one. So
Yeah.
good places.